Tom Wolfe is probably the most skillful writer in America. I mean by that he can do more things with words than anyone else. He is like the pianist Henry Scott, who can play The Flight of the Bumblebee wearing mittens. Apart from that, he is a leading figure in the new journalism, which weds the craft of the novelist to the obligations of the journalist. And on top of that, he has written a very, very controversial book for which he has been publicly excommunicated by the bishops who preside over the New York Review of Books. Mr. Wolfe was born in Richmond, Virginia in 1931, took his B.A. at Washington and Lee University. His principal enthusiasm was for baseball pitching, and he hoped to become a professional, failing which he dropped out, going to Yale and taking a doctorate there in American Studies. He worked briefly as a copy boy for the New York Daily News, principally because an editor there desired the experience of having a Ph.D. bring him his Coca-Colas. Then the Washington Post, then the Herald Tribune, and now he is an editor of New York Magazine. His articles published there and in Esquire are regularly compiled into books with crazy titles. The first was the Candy-Colored Tangerine Flake Streamline Baby. Then there was the Pump House Gang and the Electric Kool-Aid Acid Test. And now Radical Chic and Mau-Mauing the Flak Catchers. The first part of which is about the famous party that Leonard Bernstein gave to raise money for the Black Panthers, who had been indicted for conspiring to bomb a few racist department stores at Easter time. I should like to begin by asking Mr. Wolfe whether he thinks on second thought that he behaved insouciantly toward the plight of the Panthers.
Insouciantly?
Yeah. You like that?
Yeah.
You can have it.
It's a good $9 word, yes, yes. Well, you know, I couldn't, it didn't start out even thinking about the plight of the Panthers, to tell the truth. And I like to think that it brought up something more important than the plight of the Panthers also. I remember while I was sitting at that party, suddenly it came into my mind, God, Balzac should be here. And then I said to myself, well, I'm here, what do we need Balzac for? And because it really was immediately what struck me was not a political phenomenon, but a social phenomenon, and social in both a upper and lower case S, and after that an intellectual phenomenon in which the Panthers were chiefly counters in the game, and I think they're still fulfilling that role.
Well, Mr. Epstein, in his criticism of your book, did acknowledge that there was a sort of an over-contrast between the opulence of the surroundings and the plight of the Panthers. And then he said that Wolfe should have seized on this absurdity between the opulent surroundings and the plight of the poor, and in his cruel and shallow way make fun of it is understandable, nor is it difficult to understand that for the rich to indulge the revolutionary fantasies of the alienated poor is an affront to the values and interests of nearly everyone else. Now, when you read that passage, did you feel guilty about how you handled the situation?
Oh, well, first thing I felt was, of course, that I was glad to see the New York Review bringing out one of its sort of incognito star members, Jason Epstein, because
it's not Epstein like Bernstein.
Don't hold me to it. I don't
well,
know.
You made a point of that.
I don't know. I think it's Epstein. But in any case, in the piece itself, of course, I had characterized the New York Review of Books by one of the nicknames that it's known by, namely the Parlor Panther, with the O-U-R spelling of parlor, which sort of signifies the
Anglophilia?
The coexisting premises of the New York Review, the Anglophilia that they're so fond of, and the nitty-grittiness of the ghetto warriors, sort of casting Eldridge Cleaver and Huey Newton as this Simon Bolivar, and Jose Marti of the ghettos. And I could see Jason Epstein sort of working overtime to try to. He very meticulously tried to take everything that I had said about that particular milieu and turn it upside down. I particularly liked his attempts. He uses what I call vacuum words. He really wanted to establish the fact that somehow I was in league with, I believe he said, Spiro Agnew, the Kent State Grand Jury. And the way he worded this was to say that I was somehow a reflection of these things. A reflection is, of course, a vacuum word. It just invites you to fill the vacuum with whatever you can make of the word reflection. Now, somehow I couldn't bring myself to feel very guilty after reading that.
Well, one reviewer who liked your book, as a matter of fact, he introduced his review of it by saying that you combine the talents of Thornstein, Veblenbo, Brummel, and Lucretia Borgia. But he said that your highest pitch of eloquence came, quote, in this catalog of every Jewish liberal's composite nightmare, now he's quoting from you, Mitchell and Agnew and Nixon, and all of their Captain Beefheart, Maggie and Jiggs, New York Athletic Club, troglodyte, crypto-horsed vessel, Irish oyster bar construction worker followers. Is this what was supposed to have come from the reflection that Mr. Epstein invited?
And, you know, I find often when I write a piece like this that when I use a device of, in the third person, trying to express the sort of the thoughts and feelings, to some extent, the motivations of people I'm writing about. And in this passage, of course, I'm describing I think, a pretty accurate picture of what the people at that party felt. I mean, this is a kind of verbal syndrome that I think the people there would feel. I notice sometimes in reviews we'll take things that I have said when I think that I'm capturing the voice of somebody else and make this my voice. I don't know if that's the point you're making. But,
well, I'm trying to find out actually what it was that caused so many people who reviewed your last book, many of them coming from magazines that reviewed your previous books rather enthusiastically, to turn against you so heatedly. And the obvious explanation is that they are a part of a fraternity of which Leonard Bernstein was at that particular moment the spokesman, whom you embarrassed as a result of permitting them to see what, in fact, they look like when seen, if you like, objectively, if you like, from another vantage point, or whether there's something else that you did there that is worthwhile identifying. Do you have any ideas about that?
I think it's always good for mental health to assume that there are some reviewers who simply don't like a book when they give you a bad review. So I'm not throwing off that possibility. I was quite prepared, though, I think there was bound to be a certain amount of hostility, which of course did crop up after this piece came out, because it turned out I was the man who laughed in church. You know, the man who laughs in church, nobody ever asked him what's funny. They always say, how dare you? That's the only question you get after doing that. And certainly there really is a kind of, there is obviously a religion of the intellectuals. And I think in that extent, I certainly laughed in church a bit. And so this was bound to happen. In fact, I think if nobody had reacted with real hostility, I would have been in the sort of unfortunate position that David Levine often finds himself in, who I do admire his work very, very much. But he feels that he has absolutely disemboweled someone with his pen, and he's just done the final job. And
they write in after the original?
The next day, now they don't wait to write. The next day they call on the telephone and say, "Can I buy it? Is there any way I can get it?" I didn't have the same kind of phone calls.
Well, before we go on to some of what you intended to accomplish artistically, I think it's worthwhile to ask you to comment on 3 or 4 things that were said about you, because they would seem, at least they were intended to attach, not merely to you in this particular performance, but you sort of generically, and I'd like to see what you think about it. For instance, he said Wolfe's sin is a lack of compassion. Now, is it correct to conclude that you showed a lack of compassion by failing to identify yourself with the cause of Black Panthers who were up on $100,000 bail pending their trial? Do you think that the compassionate should have gone forward to make that bail available to them?
I really don't care whether. I mean, it's not a subject I'm able to. I mean, it's not a way I'm able to approach a subject like this. I know it's a very typical way of approaching a subject like this, and many writers today either approach a subject out of compassion or out of some kind of moral or political motivation. To me, it's really beside the point. It's not so much a having or not having compassion. It's really, for what I'm doing, it really strikes me as beside the point.
Well, would you feel that any situation is subject to the kind of treatment that you gave this situation, or would you hold that some are, in the nature of things, sacrosanct?
No, I hope. Well, I think it could happen that I would get into, or circumstances could be such that I would start taking a political stance myself, or a compassionate stance, or an incompassionate stance. Well, and this could happen, but I'd like to think that I would approach any situation, no matter what I was writing about, with the same kind of viewpoint which I approached this, which was basically an analytical viewpoint. In certain situations, merely being analytical can seem the height of skepticism, and I think we're in that kind of atmosphere today.
Well, would you have written, say, a funny piece about Father Damien tending to the lepers in Hawaii a half century ago?
I wouldn't want to rule out the possibility. I've never saw it. Well, I don't know. I wouldn't want to rule out the possibility.
In other words, there might be enough of a comic ingredient there to cause you to fasten on it rather than the other aspect of what he was up to.
I couldn't say without seeing it.
But you can conceive of it.
Certainly, I could. No, it's hard to even conceive of it because I really don't. I mean, that's a scene that I haven't been in and don't know. I always think of Balzac's statement when people were trying to find out his political stance on his novels, and he would always say, "I belong to the party of the opposition, which is called life," and so I can put that in his mouth. It would sound pompous to say it today, but it's really the way I feel.
But the Panthers surely were in opposition more than District Attorney Hogan in this particular situation, weren't they?
In opposition to what, though?
In opposition to what is powerful. The Panthers are the dissenters in the existing situation.
But you see, I wasn't writing. But I wasn't writing about the Panther situation. I was writing about. I was really writing about a statosphere that we now know as social and intellectual life, because the two are very closely combined now. There's really a.
Well, I guess it's fair at least to conclude that although it may not say anything about your resources of compassion, these weren't the instincts that were primarily aroused on that occasion.
No, they weren't, because again, it's very hard for me to approach these things emotionally. I'm not devoid of emotion, but it's very hard for me to go into a situation like that, to write about it, and to rebound off an emotional response to it. And I think it very much clouds the issue. I keep thinking of an article I read in Scanlon's Monthly, which was by a man who had been to Cuba, and he was writing about what he had seen there in the last 8 months. And he began it with a little preamble in italics, which said, "Some of what I'm going to say in this piece may not seem flattering to the revolution and to the movement and to Fidel Castro." He says, "But I want you to know beforehand that I marched at Selma, and I went here and I went there." And he really gave his credentials in at great length.
If one marched at Selma, does that mean one was headed towards Havana?
Well, you'd have to ask him. He was talking about the movement in general. In fact, I think he actually used the capital M to include a lot of things. And So he established his credentials, and then he quoted from a Soviet writer who had said, "The truth is always revolutionary," as if to say, even though the truth that I'm going to present here is against the movement, may seem against the movement, there's still the possibility. Well, I think this is a terrible kind of contortion to have to go through, even in the privacy of your study before you write something. And I don't know why so many people do it. To me, it's a very strange phenomenon.
Well, now, he then goes on to list a couple of other of your alleged disqualifications, but I think in order for all of the listeners to understand the depths of Mr. Epstein's objections, it might make sense to give those of them who don't know your work an idea of the kind of thing that he reacts to. He didn't single this particular passage out, but I guess it's not unrepresentative. This is also from your book, or the second part of your book, which is an essay on how people in San Francisco who want to qualify for the poverty program end up commending themselves to the people who disperse the money, and apparently this has developed into some sort of a confidence game, during which, of course, it becomes your role to terrorize the poverty fund administrator, so as to make him all the more profuse as he suggests his gratitude. So he talked about one guy, and he said there was one genius in the art of confrontation who had Mau-Mauing down to what you could term a laboratory science. He had it figured out so he didn't even have to bring his boys downtown in person. He would just show up with a crocus sack full of revolvers, ice picks, fish knives, switchblades, hatchets, blackjacks, gravity knives, straight razors, hand grenades, blowguns, bazookas, Molotov cocktails, tank rippers, unbelievable stuff. And he'd dump it all out on somebody's shiny walnut conference table. He'd say, "These are some of the things I took off the boys last night." Now, that's the kind of thing that obviously distresses people with Mr. Epstein's vision. And he calls you, for instance, intellectually weak. And he says that you show off a tendency to, quote, panic when you find yourself beyond your depth frailties, beyond the depth and frailties that commonly accompany moments of great personal or public stress. So I guess he wants to know whether your act of hysteria is a reflection of your fear that you might be imminently dispossessed by the Black Panther class in a loose alliance with the Leonard Bernstein class. Did that motivate you?
Well, actually, I was very glad to see him call it panic or hysteria, because so many of my more hostile critics had accused me of being overcool in all of these situations, devoid of compassion, as you just said. And I suppose a person could be panicked and hysterical without compassion or lack of it entering in one way or the other. This was, you really should go further into the thing, because he also says that the cause of my panic was the failure of my idols. And this was marvelous vacuum writing, because he never says who they are, you understand. And the first thing I could think of was the Mets last year. Or the fact that Hank Greenberg didn't win the home run championship in '38. I mean, I don't know exactly I really don't know what he's talking about.
Well, his words exactly were that the present moment suggests a grotesque reenactment of those deluded times in which fantasies of betrayal and bad faith are proposed to explain why our complacency is less than perfect. So as I understand it, there are some people who are saying, look, you've got a Black Panther situation that really comes out of the genes of America. We created them, but having created the situation in which they prosper, we would rather rev ourselves up into a war against the Black Panthers and face up to the delinquencies of our society that made probable their arrival on the scene. and that you, as sort of a bard of the establishment, simply make that a happy endeavor by going and simply ridiculing those people who, with the refined conscience of Leonard Bernstein, see to the possibilities of doing something about what it is that distresses the Black Panthers. Now, what do you make of that thesis?
You see, it's very hard for me to answer that because none of these questions entered my mind when I wrote it. When I wrote it, I sort of I felt that I had discovered the purloined letter. You know, in the purloined letter, everyone looked all over the house and never found the letter because it was lying on top of the table. Well, the most obvious thing about the poverty program, and a lot of programs that circled around the poverty program, which the poverty program kind of kicked off, was the act of confrontation. And everyone knows that these things took place. I don't think many people realize how many confrontations, unpublicized, that there have been over the last 3 or 4 years. And a great deal of the actual quality, the substance of the poverty program came out in confrontations. Most of the books that have been written, such as Maximum Feasible Misunderstanding, while it's quite a well-written book, it's like most books on the subject, is written from the chart room. It's what went wrong in Washington. Well, I suppose things did go wrong in Washington, but finally all the things that came down from the chart room finally were enacted out on the street or in somebody's office. And it happened in terms of this thing called the confrontation. And no one, to my knowledge, had ever bothered to write about the stratagems and the mechanics of this. And as I say, the confrontation really was a game that was not the cynical invention of the militants. It was something forced upon them by in many cases, the poverty program itself, because the poverty program had a theory that the real leaders in a ghetto situation would show themselves by doing something of a militant nature. So if a person didn't do something, or a group didn't do something of a militant nature, it wasn't considered to be truly part of the leadership of it became a terrible kind of circular reasoning and a kind of circular trap for people. And
in other words, the liberals who conceived the poverty program said, in effect, it is going to justify itself insofar as people rise and accept responsibilities, and then by the bootstraps, their own bootstraps, sort of lift the community up from it. And to the extent that that failed, they are the ones who are bewildered, but are annoyed at the fact that there was somebody around there to photograph the circumstances that caused them to fail, which was you understood to be your role here.
Well, they were sophisticated. The planners were sophisticated enough to realize that by going to what were considered to be Negro leaders back in '67 or '68, that you could go to somebody known as a Negro leader and ask him to either cool off a hot situation or do this, and nothing would happen. So then a theory was hit upon. Actually, the theory came out long before that. You can trace it right back to a book by Eric Hobsbawm about social banditry, in which he traces many movements, including the mafia in Sicily years back, saying that many people like the mafia are proto-revolutionaries. Their action takes the antisocial forms of robbery and this sort of thing. They're really revolutionaries at heart. And he goes all through history. It's a very sophisticated book. And I think there's a lot of overlay thinking goes on in this world, in which you take a kind of acetate overlay of something you've read or another situation, and you put it on top of an existing situation. So the acetate overlay was put down, and a lot of people decided that the youth gangs in the slums were social bandits, i.e. proto-revolutionaries. And these were the natural leaders, considered to be the natural leaders. In some cases they perhaps were, but in many cases they weren't. And in either case, there seemed to be nobody who even took the trouble of doing what I did, which is just simply to look at it and see try to make out what actually is taking place.
Well, assuming, Mr. Wolfe, that you were to, let's assume what I think it is safe to assume, that the overwhelming majority of the people who read what you have to say do so because they want to be entertained. You write very entertainingly, but suppose that you were to do away with them for a moment and say, okay, here is what I demonstrated after my 20,000-word piece on Leonard Bernstein and the Black Panthers. What I demonstrated about the existing situation is what?
Well, first of all, I like to think that most of those readers are very thoughtful.
Sure, sure. No, there's no reason why
Thoughtful
they
folks,
shouldn't be thoughtful
all
at
right,
all.
I'll go. I was really making a point about status in America right now, and a phenomenon that really has analogies in what happened after the French Revolution, in which you had, by say 1830 or 1840, a kind of strange emotional alliance between in the case of France, the old aristocracy, and the peasants, and the intelligentsia, or the intellectuals, which led to an intelligentsia in France that was in sort of permanent opposition to the rising class of the Industrial Revolution, the classic bourgeoisie. And I don't think there ever has been in this country a real intelligentsia in the sense of a group with a coherent lifestyle and shared values, and something that really has an identity until rather recently. I think it's a fairly recent thing, due in part to the rise of the university, or the necessity of a university education in order to get almost anywhere in American life. As soon as the BA or BS becomes your passport to almost anything of higher status in life, but really the status of the intellectual is raised a great deal. And there are other factors that made this start to happen. But along with this becomes this kind of a curious, I say, emotional alliance between your intelligentsia and your upper classes with what has taken the place of the peasantry in the old scheme.
Which would be the revolutionists?
No, well, it turns out to be what is looked upon as a revolutionary student class. You can't call it a class. Plus what is now known as the underclass, which would be people in the ghettos. And I don't think this has ever been pointed out or
and that was the purpose of that essay, to point out what, that the relationship existed, or that Leonard Bernstein was trying to affirm it, or that the leading intellectual class was coming to it rather reluctantly, or that it had to be seduced there by having an especially fetching party in especially glamorous circumstances.
Well, to show that it existed.
To show that it existed.
Yeah. Because I really see my role in anything of this sort, and in fact I always have, as to discover in some way. And one thing that worries me about a lot of the manifestos that are presented for writers and other people is they always tell you what to believe, and they never tell you to go out and do something. They never tell, manifestos for intellectuals never say go out and discover, go out and see for yourself, bring us back a report or anything. It reduces intellectual activity to a kind of ministry, I think, and I think that's unfortunate.
Well, except isn't it the assumption of the people who write these manifestos and exhort their colleagues? Isn't it their assumption that the homework has already been done? For instance, if you say, let's go down and storm the Pentagon to show that we reject the Vietnam War, it would hardly be appropriate for them to say, before you do so, consult the following list of books, in order to make certain that you do resent the Vietnam War. They assume that you have done.
No, well, you're absolutely right. They do make that assumption, and I think it's often a false assumption. And many people feel if they read the New York Times daily, with some, for 45 minutes, which is sort of like a 4-mile run or something, that you will come up with, you'll have all this raw material that is there, and all these little drudges known as the reporters, the journalists, have gone out and dredged this up for you, and it's there to be assimilated by your higher sensibility. And often the failure of this is simply the fact that these reports aren't adequate. In any case, I don't think that the contribution of the real contribution of a writer, if he really values writing, I don't think it is not to make the moral point. It is to discover. In fact, I think of a lot of moralistic writing as a moral cop-out, which would be just the opposite of what a lot of other people would call it. I think that in many cases, if you have your mind made up, or if you have a cause in mind, this makes you feel, well, why, if you're writing something about a particular subject, why should I really wear myself out gathering evidence when we already know the conclusion? Why don't we just get on with it and present the conclusion?
Yeah, but
this is the greatest vice. This is the greatest vice of journalism in our times, I think.
But you weren't gathering evidence on this famous occasion. You were really making fun of a situation. You were really throwing light on a whole series of paradoxes, which couldn't stand your kind of scrutiny. Now, if you have somebody who is who writes in a leading literary fortnightly, and he is so square as, in fact, to call you to moral account because you didn't sort of put on your moral high boots the moment you entered the room and sort of write checks and cheer at the right moments and so forth. What are you going to say about the extent to which the critical capacities of the leaders of the intellectual class show themselves to be deficient in this, as in so many other instances?
Well, they kind of, to that extent, they divorce themselves from critical faculty.
It's the ideologization of art completely, isn't it? Or is it?
I don't know if it's complete, but it certainly becomes a ruling passion in that situation. I mean, that should really be, I think that should be the last question that someone, particularly in a critical review, should be asking, you see. But it becomes the first question.
Well, suppose you had written a piece about a meeting of the John Birch Society. Let's say Robert Welch was there, and 40 or 50 prominent business people. And he talked about how the Soviet Union was going to win, was going to conquer America in late 1971. And he gave a lot of instances of people who were dominated by the Communist Party and mentioned all, well-known communists like McNamara and Dean Rusk and so on and so forth. Now, if you had written the same kind of piece about that situation as you did about this situation, do you think that a Mr. Epstein would have faulted you for a lack of compassion because you didn't understand the true fear that some people have over the possibility that the communists would take over the United States? Or do you simply think that his attitude would have been completely different and predictable?
I think it probably would have been completely different, certainly.
Do you think he would have admit?
He would have been...
Do you think he would admit that?
No.
You don't?
No.
Well, are you worried? I mean, is there reason for people to worry? Because one of the most pretentious, well, certainly one of the most prominent, and at least one of the most pretentious literary fortnightlies simply let something like this go without any sense of tentativeness.
You mean, should I be?
Embarrassment. Yeah, you're embarrassed, aren't you? Mm. After all, to a certain extent, your fate as a writer is in the hands of the critical medium, and there's been a noticeable drop in your popularity since you leveled your guns at something which a lot of them consider to be rather pious.
Well, I don't think there is I really don't think there is a literary establishment in America the way there is, say, in France. In any case, I don't think you can afford to be worried about things like that. It gets to be pretty silly stuff. I mean, eventually, as in this case, I've sort of been like there was a man that Huizinga mentions in Homo Ludens, an English duke who, during the War of the Roses, found the Reds and the Whites on the battlefield getting ready to charge at about 6 o'clock. And this happened to be the day that he always went fox hunting. And he was damned if any mere war was going to stop him. So he just headed out with his horses and his dogs. And of course they both charged at him and they put off their own battle for another. He was just absolutely annihilated him. Well, I suppose that's a risk. It's a risk you can run. Everyone hates a spoil sport more than the enemy when you get right down to it. But I think in many times a spoil sport can be a very valuable creature. Somebody's got to do it on some occasions. And,
well, to begin with, that takes a certain amount of sang-froid to be able to go fox hunting in the middle of a considerable war. Point one. Point two, it takes a lot of self-assurance, and I don't deny that you have a lot of self-assurance, and that you can wring a living from the stones if need be. But what about people who don't have those advantages, would you concede that there is a class of people who have suffered artistically as a result of the kind of thing that Mr. Epstein is able to do to them when they commit some ideological peccadillo?
I think they're sad people if they are. I think they're people who are censoring themselves, which is another thing that is.
Why would you call somebody sad who is, let's say, 45 years old and is a professor, an assistant professor of history, and he simply never gets promoted because it was known that he cast a vote for Goldwater? I mean, maybe you aren't compassionate after all. But it seems to me that this is a critical thing that happens to him in his life. If he is passed over and sees the whole future of his life stretching out before him without any kind of recognition, which is in part the toll that has been exacted for disagreeing. That's more than just an ephemeral sadness, isn't it?
I know there are situations in universities now which are very similar to what you're talking about, but I think it would amaze people at how we're talking about now what is basically an intellectual fashion, which in many cases has no ideology behind it. This particular generation of ideologues really knows very little even about Marx. It's often amazing how little is known even about a staple like Marx or even Freud, and so it becomes reduced to a kind of fashion, and fashions wilt very easily before the slightest show of confidence, I think.
And you have wilted some?
Well, I don't know, but I think a lot of people who are worried about such things are just worrying too much. And
I didn't want to give the impression, Mr. Wolfe, that the whole of the literary critical community is is massed against you. For instance, Carl Shapiro wrote in Bookware, "Let us pay homage to Tom Wolfe right off the bat. He has given us the finest mugshots of the soi-disant revolutionaries we shall see in a long time. He has pinned their little wriggling personae to the bulletin board for all to gaze upon. He has performed necessary acts of vilification with a superb aristocratic cool. He is a master of intonation and an extrapolator who can put to shame the regnant sociologists of guilt and hedonism. He has analyzed the general intellectual narcosis of the present generation and described its lifestyle in all its blazing vacuity. Tom Wolfe is more than brilliant, which his first critics noted in full. He is more than urbane, suave, trenchant, and all those book review adjectives. He really understands his subject, is really compassionate when possible, really involved with what he says and clearly responsible to his judgments. He is a goddamn joy." Now, this actually was said about your penultimate book, and I was just wondering whether anybody came through with that kind of enthusiasm for the existing volume in light of the fact that you picked on a tenderer subject.
well, some of the returns are in from upstate now, and
The farm vote?
and I seem to be doing better there. Matter of fact, Book World and others had some very, very good reviews of this book. But it really wasn't a book that I did with the slightest expectation that I was going to share myself with great reviews. I knew it wouldn't happen, and it hadn't happened.
And you say, in a sense, you're pleased that it didn't, because it shows that that you wounded where people needed to be wounded.
Well, if you think you've hit a nerve and it turns out you haven't, that you just created a pleasant itch, it's kind of disappointing.
Mr. Greenfield?
I think that a lot of the controversy comes about for reasons you've discussed. Namely, you took a situation which most people would approach politically and approached it apolitically. In other words, the fact that this was not a rally in support of the Panthers, but a meeting to raise money for their bail, a separate issue, one which a political analyst would understand why rich people were invited to. If you're raising money, you have rich people to your fundraiser. That was sort of sloughed over in your analysis of groping for status in America and identifying with new heroes. What struck me about it that bothered me, and perhaps wrongly, was the way you invested people with thoughts, dreams, and in one case, a rather elaborate and specific fantasy. And whether this was a product of a bootleg psychiatrist tape or your own inventiveness, I don't know. But the thing
May I just mention that? Because I'm glad to have a chance to talk about that dream you mentioned.
The Bernstein dream.
Because many people picked me up on that. And I started to put a footnote in the book, but at the beginning of a story that you feel has tremendous pace, you really don't feel like throwing in a footnote there. Perhaps I should have. Anyway, that came from a book called The Private World of Leonard Bernstein by John Gruen, in which Leonard Bernstein, in his own words, describes the insomniac inspiration that he had. In fact, gives John Gruen what he'd written down about what he called the Negro by the piano.
But it happens throughout the book. I mean, there are attitudes and gestures which are expanded in that style you have, just ad infinitum. And what struck me about it was that there's no way to judge the validity of those descriptions. In other words, if I were to sit here, and take shorthand, which I don't, unfortunately, and then invest in the virtue of the clothes you're wearing, in your hairstyle, an elaborate complex of what's going on in your mind, and then published it in New York Magazine, which is hardly the magazine of the great silent majority, after all. There'd be no defense that you'd have. There'd be no way for you to say, but that's an outrageous thing to say. I mean, here I am sitting here trying to talk intelligently to William Buckley, and you've skewered me by imposing what you saw in me, and it may have no relation to the fact. That's, I think, what unsettled me much more than the politics of it.
No, I think if you look at that piece, you really wouldn't find that much, or really any elaboration of people's thoughts where it wasn't accurate. There are a few cases where I said everybody thought such and such. Well, that is such a transparent. That's such a transparent device. It's not even ducking behind observers, or if later a friend of the host was heard to say any of that.
No,
stuff.
but I mean, just
just
open the book at random, and you're ascribing to one of the parties. He has to play that role. All of a sudden, he's backed into the corner, and you begin to describe an enormous complexity of thoughts, which the man, in fact, I mean, it's very entertaining, but maybe bear no relation to what's going on in that man's mind.
Well, I don't. In that particular passage, I don't think you'll find me going inside of his.
Well, you're talking about
side
defense
of his
mechanisms.
mind. I was telling you about the role that he was playing, and he was there playing it. Really. And you can argue whether or not he was playing the role. But I didn't go inside of his.
You don't think you did that in the book?
Well, can't the reader almost always judge with confidence the integrity of what it is that you impute to somebody? For instance, if somebody jumps up from the crowd and asks. And says, "To the wall, Wolfe," and you sort of open your mouth and don't say anything for a while, presumably the observer is entitled to say, "Mr. Wolfe was taken aback," without having any, without having coming forward with any sort of certificate.
No, I'm thinking.
It's really a question of whether he took more license. It's really a question of whether or not what he said was credible or appalling. For instance. Or say David Levine will show pictures of Lyndon Johnson and Nixon having lunch with, let's say, eating North Vietnamese civilians between sandwich loaves, for lunch, just a casual lunch. Now, I suppose it's altogether possible that Lyndon Johnson and Nixon, when they last had lunch, never thought of eating civilians, or far from it. And I can see that is a liberty of caricature, which for some reason hasn't been criticized. So I think it really does depend on who does it and who the victim is, doesn't it? Usually. In
many cases, but I've seen this objection before, and I think it's really so explicit, or so obvious, not always explicit when it's my opinion, when I'm describing something. I don't really think it's a problem that other people think of it. Often I think people are attacking a form.
When there's only okay. Miss Williams.
This is sort of an extension of what you all are talking about, but I wonder, what you consider the role of fact in journalism. I mean, you write so often of incident, and I wonder if this, as opposed to, even any sort of statistical sort of thing, of which one can be very often suspect, because numbers can be one thing in one instance, and if you look behind and see how they're defined, they can be something else. And I wonder if you know, if it's entirely personal style and predilection for writing about incidents, or if you know, in fact, have some mistrust of a very factual kind of journalism.
Well, I would dispute the premise of that, because this thing has been dubbed the new journalism, which I've worked in and other people have also been working in, really is so totally dependent on reporting of a depth that I don't think anyone else has ever done. That I hate to even hear anybody say that it's personal and not factual. In many cases, the things that I write are not even personal in the sense of being in the first person or expressing sort of my view of the world. There's a great belief now that the substance of the new journalism is that the writer reaches down his throat and sort of pulls his guts out back through his mouth and lays them out on the table for you. And this is the way to arrive at the truth, because the only truth is subjective. It's sort of a great, that really does become kind of facts are beside the point festival when this goes on. In fact, the kind of thing that I have done, the kind of thing that, say, Gay Talese did in his book on the New York Times, or that John Sack in his book on Vietnam, or Mike Hare, who's coming out with a book on it. This kind of thing is done usually in the third person, and it takes the whole attempt is to bring scenes alive, to bring the people you're writing about alive. And the only way you can do this is the same way the novelist does it, which is by paying very close attention to conversations, getting dialogue accurately, getting artifacts very accurately. I'm often criticized for paying so much attention to clothes and furniture, but I think that these are shorthands to recreate the emotional atmosphere of a situation. It really becomes a prodigious exercise in sheer fact. And so, I mean, I would even object to the premise of that.
Mr. Oliver?
I'd like to ask you a question about a couple of particulars in Radical Chic, because Jason Epstein mentions them in his review. He says you were making fun of Barbara Walters and Otto Preminger. I wondered if you were, or whether conceivably there were people with whom you identified, even though you were simply reporting the facts.
Well, so much of what I do comes right out of material I'm writing about, and different people interpret it in different ways. Most people, as a matter of fact, whom I spoke to, felt that Otto Preminger, for example, came out very well. That he was the man who showed great moral strength and the strength of logic in the face of a kind of wave of counter-sentiment. And on the other hand, Jason Epstein did say that I was mocking him. And in a way, I like to see this. I like to see people have opposite but equally passionate reactions to something that I have written. It makes me feel like that I have achieved a kind of objectivity by simply bringing a scene to life.
Well, surely you mean that in ambiguous situations. I mean, you wouldn't want to write a piece on Buchenwald and have people passionately pro and passionately anti-Buchenwald after you were through with it, would you?
I would like to see people, I wouldn't mind at all people having passionately differing reactions of some sort to what I described, because as long as they were passionate, it's very easy to have a kind of witless objectivity of say, the dissertation style in which people just cease caring about what you say.
Well, how about a piece, say, on Hiroshima by Don Hersey? Or what would have been the passionate anti-Hersey position in response to that particular piece?
Well, I don't ask for passion against me necessarily. I mean, you're asking about the writer in that case. No, I read that piece. I don't know the answer to that.
But using Preminger's accent, for instance, all throughout is a device, right? And it's hard for a man to be taken seriously when
It's
he's
a
the
recreation.
only...
It's a recreation.
Well, but it's the
It's an absolute
only man in the
artistic
book
requirement.
whose accent is caught, you know, and every time he speaks, he's speaking that's not, he doesn't mean that. And it's hard to take it seriously when no one else is speaking in those terms. You know, everybody else is speaking flawless English, and this one character, and he is in this thing a character, is speaking in an exaggerated German
How about
accent.
Preminger, you cannot accurately present Preminger in print. You cannot get across the
flavor,
kind of the howitzer-like quality of his of his voice without doing that. There's no other way to do it.
And
They're not,
but
the other
see,
people in the book
that's
do
it.
not speak flawlessly, if you look at it. They do not have accents, at least not the kind of accent that could lend itself to phonetics of that sort. I've seen articles, I've seen at least 8 articles written on Otto Preminger. In fact, I looked up a great many of them because I didn't take notes in
the
accent.
Yes.
And I also watched them on television many times to get it right. And most articles did not use his accent. And if you ever met Preminger and then you read one of these articles that do not use his accent, you say, that's not Otto Preminger. That's not Otto Preminger talking. And the things he says lose a lot by not putting it in accent.
Thank you, Mr. Wolfe. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, members of the panel.